Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Politico Pro's editorial director, Marty Cady.
All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining us here tonight for our event, The New Space Age, featuring NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine. Thank you to everyone joining on the live stream. My name is Marty Cady. I'm the editorial director of Politico Pro. We're thrilled to welcome you for this timely and interesting conversation. As you know, Administrator Bridenstine was sworn in as the 13th NASA Administrator on April 23rd of this year. He's leading the charge to reignite the space program and ensure American leadership in space. Tonight we're going to have a really interesting and dynamic discussion with him covering the roles of NASA's priorities in human spaceflight, the role of an accelerating private space economy, the impact of a potential Space Force, and the U.S. role in space governance. Before we begin with our panel, I'd like to thank our sponsor, Maxar Technologies, for their support in making this program happen. Also, all those light-up cocktail ice cubes are like the coolest thing, so it's really making the room colorful. Here to say a few words for us from Maxar is Howard Lance, Maxar's President and Chief Executive Officer. Howard?
Thank you. Thanks very much. Good evening, everyone. I'm thrilled you could join us for this special event. As CEO of Maxar Technologies, I get the pleasure of leading a team of about 7,000 talented scientists and engineers. You may not be that familiar with Maxar because only last October is when we created the name. But I'm quite sure you're familiar with our work and what our technologies do. As the leading company providing space communications and satellites, Earth imagery, and advanced analytics. Our SSL business is the satellite and space systems part of the company, located in Silicon Valley for many, many years. If you've ever watched DirecTV or listened to Sirius XM radio, or if you flying here today, if you're out of town, use the internet on the transcontinental flight, then you've experienced SSL satellites in action. We built more geo communication satellites than any other company, and in this decade alone are about to launch our 50th spacecraft. We're also involved in supporting NASA on the Restore-L program and DARPA on the RSGS program. What do these acronyms mean? Well, what's important about it is that we're building a future capability to do robotic servicing in space. This will mean that space infrastructure will no longer have to be built on Earth, but in space as well. SSL is also at the heart of a program called Psyche, a scientific mission where we're going to explore a metal asteroid located between Mars and Jupiter. Our MDA company is based in Canada. MDA has a long history as a partner with the Canadian Space Agency as well as NASA. Of course, they're most well known for the production of the Canadarm, which was originally in use on the Space Shuttle and now has been in use for 17 years on the International Space Station, and in fact has been memorialized on the Canadian $5 bill. Our Digital Globe business is the global leader in Earth imagery from space. We operate imaging satellites that support global defense and intelligence missions for the U.S. and our allies. We power the data behind Google Maps and Apple Maps. We give the data to Uber so they know where to pick you up and drop you off. If they don't, that's not our problem, by the way. And more importantly, we get to work with agencies and organizations like the Gates Foundation, where we're able to identify remote villages across Africa where they're working to try and eradicate polio and malaria. The bottom line is we're trying to create the digital globe, a digitized history of everything going on the planet, accessible from our platform, and providing unique insights for our customers. And finally, our business based here in DC, Radiant Solutions, provides geospatial analytics and artificial intelligence capabilities to the U.S. government and commercial customers. Enough about Maxar. Our special guest tonight is a true patriot. He served our country for the past 2 decades and is a longtime advocate for space. Jim Bridenstine is a naval aviator, a combat veteran, former congressman from Oklahoma, and for the last 10 weeks, the NASA Administrator. As a member of the House Science and Technology Committee, Jim was one of the most outspoken and productive members of Congress on space issues. He was the author of the American Space Renaissance Act, an ambitious bill aimed at breaking down barriers between civil, military, and scientific space operations. Additionally, Jim was a co-sponsor of the American Space Commerce Free Enterprise Act. Passed by the House in April, this will modernize commercial satellite regulations and, we believe, strengthen U.S. competitiveness. Of course, Jim now leads the agency responsible for executing an incredibly ambitious agenda for space as laid out by the White House. NASA is working toward sending the first astronauts to the space station aboard commercial launch vehicles and fostering a new era of commercialization in low Earth orbit. It's preparing to launch a host of new Earth observation and space exploration satellites and spacecraft that will allow us to better understand our planet and the universe. And in the next few months, NASA spacecraft will land on Mars to study its seismic activity and rendezvous with an asteroid before returning to Earth. Then there's the whole future of deep space exploration. The Space Launch System and Orion spacecraft will soon make their first flights and eventually onto the moon. NASA and its partners are leading the way for the next chapter of human exploration on the way to Mars and beyond. These are just a few of the topics I'm sure we're going to hear about. So please join me in welcoming our Politico moderators, Jacqueline Klimas and Brian Bender, and of course, our special guest, NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine.
Well, great. Thank you guys all so much for joining us, everyone both in the room and watching via the live stream online. Special welcome to my mom, who traveled down from Connecticut to be here tonight. I spotted her in the audience.
And the NASA Administrator is really here, and he is coming. Okay.
My name is Jacqueline Klimas. I'm Politico's national security reporter. This is my colleague, defense editor Brian Bender. We are the co-authors of the weekly Politico Space newsletter. If you guys don't subscribe, you should. Like the enthusiasm. Before we get started, I want to remind everyone that we will be taking questions from the audience at the end, so start thinking now. Please raise your hand if you have a question, and someone will come to you with a mic, or you can also chime in on Twitter using the hashtag PoliticoSpace. And we will be tracking questions via Twitter. These days, there aren't too many places where Democrats and Republicans actually agree and can work together in Washington, and space is actually one of them. President Trump talks about space all the time. Most recently, today, he was talking with a group of young people touting the Space Force and saying that space is a key priority for his administration. And there's also so much ongoing legislative work on the Hill and policy conversations moving forward to really set up an environment for the second space age that will help industry thrive in the United States. So with all of this going on, we're excited to have Jim Bridenstine here today. Awesome. I promise he's coming. Yay, there he is, man of the hour. Okay, grand entrance. Thank you. So we have here, I'm sure he's no stranger to anyone in this room, one of the key architects of Trump's space agenda, NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine, who's been on the job for just a little over 2 months. He previously was a pilot in both the Navy and the Oklahoma Air National Guard, and most recently was a Republican congressman from Oklahoma. He actually got into aerospace and wanted to become a pilot. He was at a summer camp in 5th grade that had a wind tunnel, and that's what inspired him.
Because every summer camp has a wind tunnel.
So thank you so much.
That is a true fact.
Thank you so much for joining us. And with that, we're going to dive right in.
Thank you for having me.
So one of your biggest challenges as the NASA administrator is figuring out the balance between where the government mission should begin and where NASA should look to the commercial sector, which is doing all these crazy, innovative, awesome things. And earlier this month, President Trump said that if one of the billionaires at the helm of these companies makes it to Mars before the government, we'll be very happy and you'll be even more famous. As long as it's an American rich person, that's good, they can beat us. And this is a sentiment that he reiterated today. But human exploration has always been the unique purview of NASA. So do you care if a private company gets to Mars first? And more broadly, where should the government look to the commercial industry to lead?
So do I care if they get there first? The answer is yes, I want them to. The reality is what matters is accomplishing the task. And if a private individual or a commercial company can do it first, then we are all for that. I would say, you mentioned earlier where commercial fits in and that kind of thing in the architecture. What NASA needs to do is we need to be in places where commercial industry is not. Like if there is a commercial provider doing something, then we need to be a customer. We need to be one of many customers. And of course, if we're one of many customers, we're hoping there are many providers, and they're competing against each other, driving down costs, increasing access, competing on innovation, doing all those things to give us more capability for a lesser price. That's ultimately our objective as NASA, is taking advantage of that robust commercial marketplace. And then what we do is we do what commercial industry won't do. Things that the return on investment isn't there yet, or there's too much risk. What NASA needs to do is move out forward and be in front, retire risk, and then enable commercial enterprise to come in behind. And ultimately, once commercial enterprise can take over the task, then we can go to the next step and go even further and do different things. So I think there is a lot of room for a very robust commercial marketplace that NASA can take advantage of. Again, the key is we can do more now than we've ever been able to do because of commercial capabilities, because of the reduced cost. The idea of, and I've said it before, I'm going to keep saying it, the idea of reusable rockets was an idea NASA had been thinking about since the 1960s and yet unable to accomplish. And yet now we have access to it because of commercial providers. So this is, I think, really an amazing time in history to see what we can do, taking advantage of all the capabilities that exist today that didn't exist before. And that gives us an opportunity more than we've ever done before.
On your point about if there is a commercial option or options, the government should be looking to be a customer. NASA is spending a ton of money on something called the Space Launch System.
I've heard about that.
Which is a government-run program. You know, obviously it's new, it's pushing the envelope, but it's very much akin to what NASA has done in the past. And there are many in the space industry who would say, well, should we be spending all that money on a system to do some of these things that we're talking about, to go back to the moon, to go onto Mars, when there are, if not commercial alternatives that are exactly the same, certainly lots of things going on in the commercial sector that maybe could supplant that. So do you see SLS as something that has sustainability? Is that still the model?
For now, it is, absolutely. Right now, it is the option that we have before us. We have hardware, we've got SLS, we've got a timeline for it, and we're moving out as fast as we can to get it complete. It is, in essence, the government backbone that we're going to utilize to go further than we've ever gone before as humanity. And that's a good thing for America. It's a good thing for our country. It is also true that as we think about the future, what does it look like? And as you're aware, there's a lot of new rockets that are being developed that we want to be able to take advantage of. And as we move forward, we're going to have to maybe rethink about at what point do we start taking advantage of those commercial capabilities to the extent that, again, they drive down costs, give us more capability, and at what point, what do we do with SLS? Should it become maybe the government competing against commercial? We're not there yet, but certainly, there's a horizon here. Is it 10 years? I don't know what the answer is. But what we can't do, in my view, is give up our government capability, our national capability, when we don't have an alternative at this point.
Let me ask you on the commercial side, NASA is doing things where it's looking more and more to the commercial industry to do things that it would normally either do itself or rely on traditional contractors to do. One is the commercial lunar payload servicing contract.
That's right.
Effectively to hire private companies to build landers and such to go back to the moon. Give us a sense of how big of a program you think that will be. In other words, how much will the commercial sector be playing in this return to the moon?
So we put out a draft RFP for the Commercial Lunar Payload Services Program. And we received back, I think we received back like 10 proposals or 10 companies that expressed interest and wanted to maybe make adjustments to what will be the final RFP. So that's an important milestone that there's that much interest in it, number one. And you look at the companies that are involved, that are interested, there's a lot of capability there already. That particular program, the way I frame it, the way I like to talk about it is we are trying to, as fast as we can, take shots on goal. That's the objective. Doesn't mean that if 6 companies get a contract with, NASA is going to hire them to take one of our payloads to the surface of the moon. Doesn't mean if 6 companies get a contract, all 6 are going to be successful. But here's what we know. In the process, we're going to learn things about going to the moon. A lot of people, it's lost on a lot of people that we haven't soft landed on the surface of the moon since 1972. There's a lot that has changed since then, and a lot we need to, in essence, relearn and or learn for the first time. And I think these commercial providers can help us with that process and then take that technology to feed forward to larger landers and eventually human landers on the surface of the moon.
Another program is the Commercial Crew Program, where, as I understand it, NASA is partnering with some of these private space companies to train and launch astronauts, which most people in this room know this, but it's still surprising, I think, that we haven't launched an American astronaut into space in like a decade, because they all have to be launched by the Russians.
Since
when can
2011.
we see American astronauts under that program go back to space?
Very soon. As far as the timelines go, I'm not going to change any timelines right here. Again, these are commercial providers. These are commercial providers that set their own timelines, and I'm not going to announce anything on their behalf at all. But I will tell you, we are confident with the 2 providers that we have right now for Commercial Crew, and we are anxiously anticipating a rapid return of launching American astronauts on American rockets from American soil. That is something we haven't done, as you mentioned, since 2011 with the retirement of the space shuttles. And it's a critical capability that we need to regain. And we intend to do that quickly.
Jacqueline?
So I want to talk to you a little bit about human exploration. NASA has a roadmap that was due to Congress back in December. Last time we chatted, you said it was in progress. So I'm hoping tonight you can give a little preview of what kinds of things we're going to see in there. Does it lay out specific goals or timelines for getting to the moon or Mars? Does it talk about moon or Mars or both? If you can just give any sort of idea of what's going to be in that when we finally see it.
Absolutely. So following the President's Space Policy Directive 1, there was a couple of key words in SPD 1. One of the key words was sustainable. We want to make sure that whatever architecture we develop for human exploration, that it is not something where we're going to get to the surface of the moon and then decide that it's too expensive or too risky, and therefore we're not going to go back. And so what we have to do, if it's going to be sustainable, we have to make sure that we're taking advantage, number one, of all of the commercial capabilities that exist today that didn't exist even 10 years ago. So what you'll see is a plan where we in fact do take advantage of the robust commercial capabilities. You're also going to see a plan that takes advantage of our international partners. Had a great meeting today with JAXA, for example. Hey, and it was and what we're finding in this effort is international partners are very excited about the ability of joining with NASA in this effort to reestablish, human exploration in a more robust way. Certainly, the president is committed to it. Space Policy Directive 1, is our effort to do that. And certainly, the other thing that's important to remember is that all of these technologies need to feed forward to Mars. What is the architecture that we establish on the moon that ultimately enables us to put humans on the surface of Mars? That's the objective. And so there has been a lot of discussion lately about Gateway. And people say, well, Gateway doesn't get us to the surface of the moon. And I've heard that a lot in the last 8 or so weeks, however long I've been the NASA administrator now. Here's the thing about Gateway that I think is important for everybody to recognize. Gateway gives us a key outpost in an orbital regime that is balanced between the moon and Earth. And while it's not the best orbit to get to the surface of the moon, what it does is it gives us more access to more parts of the moon than if we just go direct to the surface of the moon. If we wanted to put a human on the surface of the moon and we wanted to do it as soon as possible, what we would be able to do is we would be able to study an area of the moon that's basically 1 kilometer around the spot where we land. Imagine for a second that you're coming to Earth for the first time and you want to study the Earth, and you land in Minnesota. What are you going to learn from Minnesota about the Earth in Florida? It's different. There's a lot of differences. So what we want to do is we want more access to more parts of the lunar surface. We want commercial providers and international supporters to come along with landers and tugs to get to low lunar orbit, to get to the surface of the moon, and have more landers, all reusable. Remember, the key word was sustainable. If it's going to be sustainable, everything has to be reusable, which means that it's not going to be reusable permanently, but it will be multiple times we'll be able to use the same lander to go back and forth from the Gateway to the surface of the moon, and ultimately get more capability to study more parts of the moon than we've ever been able to see before. The other thing that's important to remember here is, from 1969 until 2008, there was a lot of people who believed that the moon was bone dry. 1969, when we landed there, to 2008, they believed it was bone dry. And it really wasn't until 2009 that we definitively knew that there's literally billions of tons of water ice at the poles of the moon. How did we go that long and believe this whole time that it was bone dry? We went that long for one reason, because we didn't have a plan to explore the entire moon over a sustained period of time in a sustainable way. Now, the water ice kind of changes the game for exploration in a lot of ways. So the idea is, number one, it needs to be sustainable, which means every element of it needs to be reusable. We need to have more access to more parts of the moon than we've ever had before. We need to take advantage of our international and our commercial partners to do that. And the other piece that is important about Gateway is all of this technology, this architecture that we build around the moon, ultimately feeds forward to Mars. That's the ultimate goal here.
And you see a big role or a significant role for commercial industry in the Deep Space Gateway? In other words,
absolutely,
building that infrastructure, not just American companies, but foreign companies. You see a commercial
100%
role in that.
So what it does, again, is look, the United States of America needs to lead this effort. The United States of America needs to establish the standards, the interfaces, whether it's power, whether it's propulsion, whether it's ultimately the docking capabilities. We establish those standards and make it public to everybody. And then our international partners and our commercial partners can join in the effort and take advantage of what I would call critical infrastructure that we've put in orbit around the moon. So
we've been talking here about sort of the government-private industry balance. Who does what? Where are there areas of cooperation? Certainly there are a lot of things that NASA does in the area of science and research and exploration of the heavens that there clearly isn't a commercial market case for, at least as anyone can tell anytime soon. A little bit of news today on the James Webb telescope.
I knew you were going to bring that up.
Which obviously is a big investment, but as a follow-on to Hubble, presumably is critical to NASA's mission. I mean, a lot of what we know about space, a lot of what we envision in our minds of what space looks like comes from programs like that. So how does NASA get its hands around that? I mean, the cost keeps going up, the schedule keeps getting delayed.
So
it's
this
close
is
to $10 billion now.
Yeah, this is a big challenge. And I will tell you, I'm going to go to the Hill next month because we're going to hit that $8 billion mark. That's how much Congress said we were allowed to spend on development. And if we go beyond that, we have to go get authorization. We have to get the whole project reauthorized. And I'll tell you what I'm going to tell them. Yes, it's behind schedule. Yes, it is over cost. Nobody at NASA is happy about this. I will tell you this, though, and I think this is critically important. It will absolutely be worth it. We are going to see cosmic dawn, the very first light from the universe with James Webb. We're going to see basically back to the beginning of the universe. And this will change our perspective of everything we know about the cosmos. And so what I would say is, yes, it's a struggle. Here's the other thing I think it's important to take away. Going back to what I said earlier about what NASA does, we do things that others won't do. We do things that are exceptionally difficult. We do things pushing the very edge of the envelope for technology and science. That means when we do these very difficult things, we're going to come up against things that are unexpected. And that's really what's happening here. And so, yes, it's a struggle. Yes, we're going to get it done. My message to the Hill is going to be that in the end, it's going to be worth it. Our number one focus needs to be mission accomplishment and schedule and cost. Don't get me wrong, we're keenly aware and concerned about that. But at the same time, as much as we've already invested and as close as we are, we're on the 5-yard line. And by the way, there are amazing successes here. I mean, the science instruments have been delivered on schedule, or not, I wouldn't say on schedule, but they've been delivered. They're ready to go. And again, that was what we believed would be the most difficult part. And of course, it's ready. So we got to get from the 5-yard line into the goal, and we can do that. And I'm fully committed to the project.
How confident are you that that message will sink into Congress on an election year when there's a lot of other stuff on Congress's plate, that they will actually reauthorize and appropriate more money for the program?
I don't know. I came from Congress, and I was on the Science Committee, which, of course, is one of the committees that I'm going to be testifying before on this. I can tell you on the Science Committee, the folks I know there are committed to it. They have been all along. They believe in it. They want to see it happen. Now that we've hit this $8 billion mark, how much enthusiasm will there be? Don't get me wrong, it's going to be a tough hearing. But at the end of the day, I think they're going to be committed to it as they have been all along.
Maybe we could press you on a couple of bigger policy questions that are swirling around these days. One thing the president has talked about, as you know, a lot is, and has actually directed the Pentagon now to do, is create a space force.
I'm for it.
You've been for it.
I've been for it, yeah, absolutely.
But that gets to my question. What is it for? I think a lot of people would say, this is true, I think a lot of people would say, great idea. The president obviously supports it. The Pentagon, not so much, although now they're sort of saluting, because the commander-in-chief wants it. But there seems to be a lot of unanswered questions about, okay, well, what is this thing for?
Yeah, no, I get it.
And you've said that you think it should play a role, perhaps like the Navy does, in terms of securing commerce on the high seas.
Sure.
That a Space Force, a separate branch of the military, would defend, protect space commerce. What is space commerce? Define it for us.
Oh, wow.
What is the role of this military branch, if, by the way, it comes to pass, as you mentioned, you're from Congress.
Yeah.
Congress will clearly have to weigh in.
Yeah, well, Congress has already passed it, by the way. We did it in the NDAA last year, the National Defense Authorization Act. It was called a Space Corps. It didn't have its own
Right.
service secretary. It reported to the Secretary of the Air Force. But it's almost there based on what we passed in the House of Representatives. I voted for it 3 times. I voted yes each time. First in the Strategic Forces Subcommittee, then on the Full Armed Services Committee, and finally on the floor of the House of Representatives.
Well, what's it for?
So here's the deal. Going back to your question about what is space commerce. Think about, and a lot of Americans don't know this, how important space is to their everyday lives. The way we navigate, the way we communicate. A lot of people in this room probably have Dish Network or DirecTV. A lot of people in this room probably get internet broadband from space. If you come from rural Oklahoma, which I used to represent parts of in the House of Representatives, you probably only have internet from space available to you. If the way we do disaster relief, the way we do national security and defense with GPS and over-the-horizon communications, when you think about the way we predict weather and the way we understand the climate, when you think about this is critically important as well. A lot of people don't realize this. The GPS signal is absolutely critical for every banking transaction in this country. We lose the GPS signal and banks can't transact. That timing signal is critical for banking in the United States. Here's what we also know. And look, NASA is the peaceful space agency. We do exploration, we do discovery, we do science, and we have international partners. We're not going to get involved in the Space Force. But I'll tell you why I'm for it and why I was for it in the House of Representatives, and as a former warfighter, why I support it. All of this capability, we lose the GPS signal, banking shuts down, 3 days later, there's no milk in the grocery store. Talk about civil unrest, at the likes of which we haven't seen before. And the challenge here is you've got some of our near-peer competitors, namely China, building their own GPS constellation. At the same time, they're developing anti-satellite weapons that now go all the way up to geostationary orbit. And it's not just anti-satellite weapons, it's co-orbital anti-satellite capabilities, jamming, spoofing, hacking, dazzling. And these technologies are proliferating beyond our near-peer competitors, but around the world. So space has become very contested. And one of the things that, the challenges ahead of us are, how do we attribute, when something isn't working right, how do we attribute that? Is it coming from a threat? Is it accidental jamming? Is it an anomaly on the spacecraft itself? We need to get a lot better at doing those kind of assessments. The Space Force, though, going back to the commerce, I hope I have convinced everybody how important space is to our everyday lives.
But on the point of a Space Corps versus a Space Force, it's a big difference. Space Corps is within the Air Force, which does the space mission already, for the most part. I mean, the other branches have their pieces. But you think a standalone military force or something more contained, more beefed up, more focused within the Air Force?
So
we're getting a little beyond that.
No, this is good. This is important conversation for America to have. And I think I'm here because I think this is important. So you mentioned separating it out. If you ask the Marines, if the Marines are part of the Navy, what would they say?
Absolutely not.
They would say no, right? But yet they still report to the Secretary of the Navy. So that's the Marine Corps within the Department of the Navy. And I wear wings of gold as a Navy pilot. And Marines wear the same wings of gold. And we all call ourselves naval aviators. So a Space Corps, imagine taking, and I'm not saying this is how it would be, but imagine if you took, the Air Force Space Command and you carved out it along with the Space and Missile Systems Center. Remember, all a military service does is organize, train, and equip a cadre of people that can fight wars. But the services themselves don't fight wars. It's all about organizing, training, and equipping. And then those military services present forces to geographic combatant commanders or to functional combatant commanders in a joint force environment. So when we're talking about organizing, training, and equipping a cadre of space professionals that can fight in those battlefields that of the future, in fact, I would say the future, but it's not the future, it's right now today. When you think about that cadre, right now, they're within the Air Force, and they compete for budgets and capabilities. They compete against the air domain. There was a day when the Air Force was the Army Air Corps and the Army Air Services and the Army Air Forces. And finally, in 1947, we passed a bill. It was Congress that forced it to happen with the National Security Act, 1947. They finally said, we need a separate strategic bombing force that would be separate from the Army, because the Army wanted it to only be focused on the forward line of troops.
It's interesting to me, when you first started talking about space commerce and the role of space in our lives and how critical it is to protect that, you were talking in very defensive terms. But now you just said the word war a couple times, and war fighting, et cetera. Some people think or worry that a space force or a standalone cadre of space professionals would be overly threatening, that it would cause Russia, China, other countries to create similar forces. And then we do what we don't want to do, or we say we don't want to do in the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. We militarize space in a way where it becomes another, not just battle space, but battle zone. So how about this idea of also creating, and maybe not as an alternative, but in addition, a space guard? People talk about, well, why not model it on the Coast Guard?
Yeah.
A constabulary force in space that's a regulatory force that makes sure everybody plays by the rules.
Oh, it's a great idea.
Could cooperate with international partners better, perhaps, than a military force? So you think it's a great idea?
Well, I wouldn't say better. I wouldn't say better. Look, here's the deal. When you talk about a space force being provocative, I think is how you were framing it. Here's what I would say. What is provocative is not being ready and not being prepared and not being able to defend. Like right now, when the Chinese call space the American Achilles heel, that should make all of us concerned. Why are they calling it the American Achilles heel? Well, that's because they've seen that the United States has believed for a long time that space is this sanctuary. And now it's not just a sanctuary, but all of us are dependent on it. And so that is why they call it the American Achilles. So the competitors of the United States get to have a vote here. And the question is, how do we respond? So that's the first thing. So I support the Space Force. Second thing is what you were talking about with the constabulary. Interesting concept, and we just had this conversation backstage, and I hadn't really thought it through very much. But I think here's kind of where that plays. You look at Space Policy Directive 3. It establishes space situational awareness, space traffic management regime, puts it at commerce, for example. So when you think about that, there's going to have to be some kind of forcing function. If somebody tells a satellite operator in high traffic orbital regimes to maneuver, if I'm flying, an F-18 Hornet and somebody says turn right 030 to descend to 10,000 feet, I do it immediately. Well, in space, it's just kind of like everybody's on their own right now. Nobody has the control of it. Now we have the Joint Space Operations Center, and we have, and they can give conjunction analysis and warning, and they do it for all the commercial operators in the entire world. They do it for free. All of that, of course, is currently underway. But nobody can compel somebody to make a maneuver to avoid a collision that ultimately could damage space for generations to come, as we saw from the 2007 Chinese ASAT test. We're still dealing with the orbital debris field from that. So the constabulary idea, again, I'm thinking out loud here, but I think it's a good idea because there's going to have to be a forcing function. I want to be clear, the president has some concerns about his own Space Policy Directive 3. And those concerns include the regulatory environment under which that happens. We don't want in any way for there to be prohibitive kind of regulations on the development of an industry that should be an American export. That we don't want that. So what we need is a very light touch regulatorily. I should say this. We want the maximum regulatory certainty and safety and the minimum regulatory burden. And ultimately, maybe what you're talking about could function in that capacity. But it's an interesting concept. It's not, when you talk about all of the civilian things that are going to be happening in space, that's why you would need that kind of capability. When you talk about the fact that war is now being threatened in space, there's a whole different capability for that that's necessary.
So you've talked a lot about the need for international partners tonight. And most people agree that if the U.S. is going to do really fantastic, difficult things in space, like putting a human on another planet. They're not going to be able to do it alone. But the state of U.S. relationships with the world right now is a little on the rocks. We're in a trade dispute with the European Union, and we're even fighting with Canada now. Both countries and entities that the U.S. has worked with their space agencies before. So is the administration's trade policy and the resulting fallout around the world impacting international cooperation in space?
I don't see it at all. Everybody I've talked to, and I've talked to folks with ESA, I've talked to folks, of course, with JAXA and other of our partners around the world. Everybody is excited about going back to the moon and what that means for their countries and how they might fit into it. I haven't seen any kind of hesitation on space cooperation. This is, again, I think this is exceptionally unique about space. You look at the relationship between the United States and Russia. It's as bad as it could be, right? Without ultimately going to war. There's all kinds of challenges right now. And at the same time, we cooperate on space, and we do it very successfully. Space cooperation, I believe, is really one of the best soft power tools of the United States of America. It is one of the best capabilities that we have. When all other communications break down because of world events, we can still have a channel of communication. That's what NASA represents. That's what space agencies around the world represent. And of course, as long as I'm the NASA administrator, that's going to be one of my key policy objectives, is to make sure that space remains that area where we can all work together regardless of things that are breaking down around the world.
So do you have any goals to further this international cooperation? We're seeing some countries stand up new space programs or move forward in their space programs. Are there any new players that you would like to see the U.S. partner with?
Absolutely. There are more nations today around the world with space programs than at any point in the history of the world. And that gives us a lot of opportunity. And I don't want to name any names because I might offend one of the ones that I don't name. But it is critically important, I think, for us to take advantage of great partnerships and for them to take advantage of a partnership with us. Again, the goal is to do more and go further than we've ever gone before. And we have that opportunity with these great partners.
One of the issues that came up during your confirmation process was some of your views on climate science. And obviously NASA does a whole bit of research in that area. And I'm curious, you've obviously been asked this question before. You've said recently that your views have changed, that you've done more reading, you've talked to more experts. My question for you is, now that you've moderated your views and you now do believe that there is significant evidence that human activity is doing some damage to the climate, what are you doing about it?
That's great.
Or what do you plan to do about it? As the administrator of NASA, is it something that's now on your radar? Well, you know what more can we be doing to understand it, to maybe mitigate it? And also, do you talk to your colleagues about it on the National Space Council? Do you talk to the president about it?
Absolutely. So here's a couple of things to note. Number one, NASA is not a regulatory agency. We don't prescribe solutions to what we find. What we do is we do science. We collect the data, we share the data, we make it available to the public, and of course we take advantage of data from our international partners as well. So NASA is committed to the science. The way we prevent it from becoming political is we follow the guidance of the decadal surveys that come from the National Academy of Sciences. And I think that's an important tool that we have in our belt to make sure that we are staying apolitical and following the science exclusively and not following political desires or political whims. A couple of things I think are also important to note. As a member of the Armed Services Committee in the House of Representatives, long before I was nominated to be the NASA administrator, a debate arose when we were marking up the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act. And when this debate came up, it was about should the Department of Defense, it was Jim Langevin from Rhode Island, had an amendment that said, we want the Department of Defense to do a study to tell us how climate change is affecting our national security posture. And that debate ensued, and of course Democrats were all in favor of the amendment, Republicans were all opposed to the amendment, and I requested to speak up on this again before I was nominated. Here's what I know as a Navy pilot. The Arctic ice has melted. And we are now defending territory as a Navy that we never used to have to defend, and the Russians are operating in territory where they never used to be able to operate. We can stick our heads in the sand and pretend like it's not happening, but the reality is the Arctic ice is shrinking, and that has strategic implications for the national security interests of our country. And I spoke up and I said that on the Armed Services Committee, that we have to understand what's happening here so that we can be prepared for the future. It's also true that as a member of the Science Committee, I spoke publicly, again, before I was nominated, to support PACE, which helps us understand, not just the carbon dioxide, but also the sinks of carbon dioxide. We're putting a lot of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. A lot of it is still there, some of it isn't. We're seeing a greening of the Earth. How do we understand how phytoplankton is affecting the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? Here's what I'll tell you that's absolutely true, and I've said it over and over again, and yet I still keep getting this question. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. Humans have contributed to the carbon dioxide in levels that we've never done before, and of course that is causing the climate to warm. What NASA does is we do the science. We try to understand ultimately what offsets that, what causes more of it. Is it a system that ultimately balances itself, or is it a system that's inherently unstable? And so if we go just a little bit off, it's going to go even faster off course. That's what NASA is working on right now. So I don't in any way reject the science at all. And what NASA is going to continue to do is following the guidance of the decadal surveys and ultimately producing the best data so that we can inform the policymakers so that they can make decisions on policy and regulation, which is not NASA's job at all.
Well, we wanted to leave some time for audience questions. I imagine some of you have some. Is there a mic? Or people just get up and shout?
Back.
We have a mic. And if you please, maybe just very briefly introduce yourself. Please wait for the mic. Introduce yourself quickly, and please make it a question and not a member of Congress.
Hank Wallace of Write and Speak Like the News. How should your fellow agencies, Administrator Bridenstine, respond to fake news? NASA has faced fake news for almost 49 years with the story that NASA astronauts landed in a desert on Earth.
So you're telling me we actually went to the moon? That's a joke, I'm kidding. So, no, it's a big deal. And if you look at, I've seen polling on this, and there's a big chunk of people that seem to believe that this is what they say. Did the moon landing ever happen, right? And the answer is there's a certain percentage of the population that doesn't believe that it did. I don't remember what the number is. It's maybe in the teens or whatever. But here's the thing. If you ask them, well, what about the other 5 moon landings? Did those happen? Or if you ask them, who would benefit from the idea that we somehow faked it? Yeah, who would benefit? Well, the Russians, because we're in the middle of the Cold War, which is the entire reason we went to the moon to begin with. Did they say anything about it not being real? No, in fact, they did just the opposite. They did everything they could to try to beat us there. And ultimately, they lost. And so that's a great moment of American history and American pride. It demonstrated American economic superiority, technological superiority, and it laid the foundation for an eventual capability that I think is important, which is not too long after the last moon landing, I guess 11 or 12 years after that, in the height of the Cold War, we had a president that went out and announced that we're going to start the Strategic Defense Initiative. And said, and of course people said it's technologically not possible, it's too expensive, we can't afford it. And yet the president at the time said, no, we're going for it. They called it Star Wars to kind of belittle him, and he owned it. And he said, yeah, it's Star Wars. We're gonna create Star Wars. It's kind of like the Space Force. Yeah, we're gonna create Star Wars. And so he owned it. And here's the thing. While a lot of experts said it could never happen, and ultimately the investment that we made in the Strategic Defense Initiative, a lot of those investments were small and it never materialized. Here's who believed we could do it. The former Soviet Union believed we could do it. And why did they believe we could do it? Because just 11, 12 years earlier, we were on the surface of the moon, and they had not achieved that. So they believed we could do it. They did everything they could in their power in the international community to make that like a provocative thing. We got to stop this. They invested money. They did everything. And so here's the important thing. While all of this credibility for the Strategic Defense Initiative, the credibility came from the Apollo program. That's how important strategically technology and science is to our country. And when we think about the future, technology and science is going to ultimately be responsible for who controls the balance of power on Earth. And NASA has a big role to play there, as we always have. And so we cannot lose sight of that. And anybody who tells the other, I'll tell you what, introduce them to Buzz Aldrin and see what happens.
Lady over there, sort of 4 or 5 rows back.
Hi, Therese Jones, Satellite Industry Association.
Hi.
First, I want to thank you for your support of the industry, both in Congress and currently as NASA Administrator. The House Science Committee just approved the American Space Safe Management Act today, which has a big role for NASA in the research and development portion of space situational awareness and space traffic management. So I was hoping you could comment on what your vision is for the role of NASA.
That's a great question. So SSA and STM, of course, is a big policy priority for the National Space Council. It's a policy priority for the administration. And NASA's role in this ultimately is technology demonstrations, doing the science and the research to make sure that we have the most robust SSA and STM capabilities. And I think also maybe, no kidding, not just technology demonstrations, but maybe even pilot programs to see if it can work. When you think about SSA, STM, historically the way it works is the Department of Defense, I should say STRATCOM, it's a joint command, a combatant command. STRATCOM, through the JSPOC, has the responsibility of doing all of the conjunction analysis and warning for the entire world for free. And they've been doing it because they were set up to protect national security assets in space. That's why they're there. And by default, as this grew and grew, it got to the point where now they're spending, we've had testimony on the Hill from my previous life, testimony on the Hill that said about 70% of the manpower at the JSPOC is focused on doing conjunction assessment and warning. Well, that takes away from a critical capability, which is ultimately defending and winning a war if necessary. So all of that challenges. So how do we reorganize this? So what we got to do is we have to take the data from the JSPOC that's unclassified, and we need to get it out of the JSPOC, and we need to get it to a civilian agency. That's one concept, is the civilian agency ultimately could take that data from the JSPOC, the unclassified data, combine it with international data, because now it's not part of the Department of Defense anymore. Now it's a civilian agency. Combine it with international data, combine it with commercial data, and ultimately create a more robust, single integrated space picture that enables us to have the best ability to avoid and prohibit collisions in space. So that's one way it could ultimately be framed. And of course, Space Policy Directive 3 puts that capability at the Commerce Department. And I think that's an important function as well for Commerce. There's a lot of reasons it should be at Commerce. But the other thing is, there's other ways to organize it. Instead of having Commerce do it as a function, what Commerce could do is Commerce could license commercial entities to provide SSA and STM. And not just license commercial entities, they could license academic institutions or nonprofits or any kind of other international consortium of providers. They could license, and then there would be a competitive market. And then if you wanted to launch something into space, you would go to one of those providers of SSA, STM, and you would prove before you launched that you were getting the data necessary to protect not only your assets, but everybody else's assets who could be affected by yours. So at the end of the day, the question is, how is it all going to be designed? And we're very early in this process. I would prefer a competitive free market kind of scenario. We want people competing to provide more data and better data. That's what we want. And we want people competing on price so that we can get the most efficiencies out of the system. And the way to do that is to have this competitive capability. And the question is, well, why would you pick one or the other if you're a satellite operator? Well, number one, maybe your insurance premiums would go down because there's less risk depending on who you choose as your provider. Number two, if you're self-insuring, well, then you're just taking care of yourself to make sure that your billion-dollar assets don't come under threat. So I think there's a lot of different ways it can be organized. I'll tell you this, it's an important function. It's quite frankly long overdue. The Interagency Space Debris Coordination Committee, which NASA is a piece of, it's 13 space agencies across the world. NASA is one of those agencies, and they've done a report, and the report says that there's going to be, if you remember the Iridium-Cosmos collision in low Earth orbit from 2009, one of those collisions is going to happen every 5 to 9 years on average. And of course, every one of those collisions begets more debris that ultimately results in more collisions. So NASA's role here is to be a partner in the technologies and maybe some of the pilot programs. The other thing that NASA does that's important, the biggest threat from debris, and a lot of people don't realize this, the biggest threat from debris is debris that's too small to be tracked at all. And so if we can't track the debris, then how do we figure out how it could affect our satellites? So what NASA does is we do probabilistic modeling and ultimately determine, before you launch a satellite into an orbital regime, how long will your satellite last based on what it's going to be pelted with, and ultimately how much shielding should you put on your satellite to increase the life of your satellite, and of course then the cost of that extra shielding. So all of these things are areas where NASA gets involved, but it's an important mission for the future.
I think we have time for a couple more. Gentleman right here in the second row. Maybe wait for the mic.
Hi, I'm Andrew Wolfram. I'm an intern at NASA.
Oh, fantastic.
You
get points for being here.
Please tell my mentor.
I think I can do that.
You very clearly depicted China tonight as a threat to U.S. interests in space.
Real quick, capabilities, not necessarily intent. I want to be clear. There's a difference between capabilities and intent.
For sure, for sure. During the February 21st National Space Council meeting, some of the commercial attendees portrayed China as more of a potential commercial partner.
Yeah.
China partners with the European Space Agency. So do you think there's a way that the U.S. can partner with China that strikes a balance between U.S. competitiveness and national security concerns? And do you foresee a repeal in the near future of the 2011 law that prevents NASA from partnering with China?
The Wolf Amendment. So on the horizon right now, I don't see a repeal of the Wolf Amendment. I don't know anybody that's talking about it. Doesn't mean that they aren't, but I'm not aware of it if they are. A couple of things. We are prohibited by that amendment. We're prohibited from doing bilateral kind of work. We can work in multilateral or we can have meetings, I should say, in multilateral environments. To the extent that eventually we get to the point where we can partner, that's going to be a decision that's made well above my pay grade. I want to be really clear about that. And it's probably going to be based on a strategic framework that deals with a lot of things that have nothing to do necessarily with space exploration. So when you think about intellectual property rights and the stealing thereof, when you think about human rights, when you think about building islands in the South China Sea and claiming territory, when you think about establishing an air defense identification zone over the Senkaku Islands, all of those kind of things, and when you think about direct ascent anti-satellite missiles that create thousands of pieces of orbital debris, and of course other activities in space that could be perceived as provocative. When you think about all these things in their collective, we have to make a determination. And of course, this is all above the NASA administrator's pay grade. But as a nation, what is our strategic interest in ultimately partnering, and what would be on the table to do that? And I don't have an answer for that at this point. That would be probably a question more for the National Security Council, of which I don't serve on. But it's a great question. It's certainly something that we need to be discussing. And of course, not apologize for our commitment to, our values at the same time. So,
Maybe on this side, gentleman in the back there with his hand up. Oh, I didn't know that I knew you.
John Simmons with the Roosevelt Group. My colleague Bud Wyatt says hello.
Oh, fantastic.
Congressman, thanks for sticking through the process. That tenacity is going to need to play out over the next couple of years with budget sequestration back on the books. Congress has done a great job, so has the administration in FY18 and now FY19. But what's going to happen FY20 and beyond, we could have a 10% cut across the board. So
Yeah.
what's going to happen to the NASA budget going forward? And if it doesn't get resolved with the budget agreement, what gets cut?
A wonderful question. Oh my gosh. This is why I ran for Congress to begin with. A couple of things. Number one, what you'll see in the president's budget requests is that NASA is very well funded. He is committed to doing big things in space and having NASA lead the way, having America lead the way. That's his commitment. Number two, even on the earth science budget, what you'll find is that the earth science budget that came out of the president for the last couple of years, we're talking about an earth science budget that is larger than 3 of the 8 years of President Obama, and in fact tied with the 4th. And so this is a very healthy earth science budget, and to the extent that it's changed from some of the others, it's not that much. So we're seeing great support from the administration for the budget of NASA. Here's what's even more amazing. From there, we're seeing bipartisan support in Congress to plus it up from even there. I mean, it really is bipartisan. People want to see the United States of America do amazing things again, have these stunning accomplishments that ultimately get all of our youth enthused about science, technology, engineering, and math. So there's a whole host of good things happening. The threat that you specifically mentioned, of course, is the sequester, and could we return to it? I don't have an answer for that, but I will tell you where I stand on this, because I ran for Congress because of this issue, and we were talking briefly backstage about this. As a Navy pilot, I was in the Navy Reserves flying counter-drug operations down in Central and South America back in 2011 and 2012, and my squadron got eliminated because of the sequester on defense. The whole Budget Control Act as a law is terrible. The idea was we're going to create a super committee, 12 members of Congress, 6 from the House, 6 from the Senate, 6 Democrats, 6 Republicans. None of them were from Oklahoma, and yet, which is where I was from, and yet they had this full authority to change federal spending and raise taxes, and to do it without any debates, without any amendments, without any filibuster. Whatever these 12 people decided, there's going to be an up or down vote on the floor of the House and the Senate, and if it failed, if that vote failed, it was going to trigger this sequester on all of the discretionary spending of the United States, which is 1/3 of our federal budget. Half of that 1/3 is defense. And of course, here I am, a Navy pilot flying counter-drug missions down Central and South America. And so this ultimately triggered, because these 12 people couldn't come to an agreement, which they shouldn't have been coming to an agreement anyway, because we weren't represented. And then ultimately, the defense sequester, the sequester in general takes place. The Department of Defense gets whacked. Capability gets lost. My squadron, we busted about $2 billion worth of cocaine every year on the high seas. And all of that cocaine, once our squadron gets eliminated, it comes into the United States. And even worse, the cash funds the transnational criminal organizations down in Central and South America, and, oh, by the way, that are now vertically integrated with northern Mexico. So this is it was a disaster. And I resolved at the time to find out if my congressman voted for that, and he did. So I ran against him, and I didn't really know that I would win, but ultimately I did. So the sequester is terrible policy. It's terrible governance. Everybody knows about it. It doesn't represent the American people. It takes away a foundational principle, which is representation. But I'll tell you what else is bad. CRs and omnibuses. Again, takes away the representation of the American people. I'm not going to talk politics, although I'd love to if there was another opportunity down the road. But the reality is we have to do big things. Our country expects it of us. And sometimes you have to make hard decisions.
Well, it looks like we're out of time. I want to thank you, Mr. Administrator, for so much of your time tonight.
Thank you.
And for being a good sport.
Always. We'll do it again.
Happy 4th of July. And I must ask you, July 2nd, as you probably know, is World UFO Day.
Oh, good.
And I want to know what you have planned.
I'm getting in one.
With that, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for everybody in the audience. Another shout out to Maxar Technologies for helping make this evening possible. And thanks to all of you in the audience. And please join us for a drink and some more conversation. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you.